I signed my divorce papers on a Thursday morning in October, and by noon I was sitting alone in a coffee shop 2 blocks from my lawyer's office, staring at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. I hadn't planned to go in. I had planned to go straight to my car and drive home and do something practical and sensible like unpack the last of the boxes that were still sitting in my new apartment. But when I walked past the window and saw the empty table by the corner, I just went in, because sometimes you need a place to sit that isn't your own life for a few minutes. The coffee shop was quiet for a Thursday. There were a few people on laptops, a couple near the window, and a man sitting at the counter with his back to me, reading something on his phone. I didn't pay attention to any of them. I ordered my coffee, I sat down, and I stared out the window at the October street and tried to feel something clear about the day I had just had. The divorce had been coming for 2 years. It wasn't a surprise, it wasn't dramatic. It was just the slow and painful conclusion of something that had stopped working long before either of us was willing to say so out loud. We had been kind to each other about it, as kind as two people can be when they are dismantling 12 years of shared life, and I was grateful for that, but kind doesn't mean easy, and it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. I was on my second sip of coffee when the man at the counter turned around. He was looking for the sugar, I think, or maybe he just shifted on his stool, and the movement caught my eye the way movements catch your eye when you're not really looking at anything in particular, and then I looked at his face, and something happened that I can only describe as the world briefly stopping. I knew that face. Not in the way you vaguely recognize someone from somewhere and spend 20 minutes trying to place them. I knew it the way you know something that was once so familiar it lived in your body, the way you know the sound of a voice you haven't heard in years, but would recognize anywhere. His name was James. And the last time I had seen him, I was 24 years old, and we were standing on a train platform, and I was telling him that I thought we should end things, and he was looking at me with an expression that I had spent the better part of 20 years trying not to think about too carefully. He hadn't seen me yet. He found the sugar, turned back to his coffee, and I sat very still at my corner table and had approximately 30 seconds to decide what to do. I could leave. I could put my coat on and walk out, and he would never know I had been there, and I could go home and unpack my boxes and add this to the long list of things that happened on a difficult Thursday in October and were then put quietly away.
Or I could stay.
I stayed. Not because I had a plan, not because I knew what I wanted to happen, but because 20 years is a long time, and I had signed my divorce papers that morning, and the world had already felt strange enough that one more strange thing didn't seem like it would make much difference. I picked up my coffee cup, and I walked to the counter, and I sat down on the stool next to him, and I said, "James." He looked up, and the expression on his face when he saw me was something I will not forget for as long as I live, because it moved through surprise and recognition and something else, something warmer and more complicated, in about 2 seconds, and then he said my name, and his voice sounded exactly the same. We sat at that counter for 3 hours. I know that sounds like a lot, and it was, but it also didn't feel like enough, because there is a specific kind of conversation that happens when you haven't seen someone in 20 years, and you both know there is history between you, and neither of you quite knows how to navigate it, and that kind of conversation has its own rhythm and its own pace, and you can't rush it. We started with the easy things. What we did for work, where we lived, the broad outlines of the lives we had built since the last time we stood on a train platform together. He was an architect, he had been for 15 years, and he talked about it the way people talk about work they genuinely love, with that specific aliveness that comes through when something is not just a job. I told him about my work, and he listened the way he had always listened, with his full attention, in a way that I had forgotten about until it was happening again right in front of me. And then, after about an hour, he asked me how I was doing, and not in the casual way people ask when they mean it as a greeting, but in the real way, the way that means I actually want to know. I looked at him, and I said, "I signed my divorce papers this morning. That's why I'm in this coffee shop at noon on a Thursday." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry." And then he said, "I signed mine 14 months ago." We looked at each other, and something shifted between us, some formality that had been holding things at a careful distance, and after that the conversation went somewhere different. We talked about our marriages. Not in a bitter way, not in a way that blamed anyone, just honestly, the way you can sometimes talk to someone who is outside your life about things you can't quite say to the people inside it. He had been married for 11 years, no children, and he described the end of it in a way I recognized completely, That particular exhaustion of two people who care about each other, but have grown so far in different directions that caring is no longer enough to hold things together. I told him about mine. 12 years, one daughter who was 10 and fierce and the best thing I had ever done, and a marriage that had been good for a long time before it wasn't, and an ending that was sad rather than angry, which was somehow both easier and harder than angry would have been. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "You have a daughter." I said, "I do. Her name is Clara." He smiled at that, a real smile, and said, "That's a good name." We were quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why did you end it?" Back then, on the platform. I've thought about it a lot over the years, and I never completely understood. I looked at my coffee cup for a moment before I answered, because it was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer, and I had spent enough years not thinking about it clearly that it took me a moment to find the honest version. I said, "I was 24 and I was scared. You were talking about moving to another city for work, and I had just started something I cared about here, and instead of saying I'm scared and I don't know how to do this, I just ended it. Because ending it felt easier than being honest about how frightened I was." He nodded slowly, and then he said, "I was going to ask you to come with me." I had the speech planned. I never got to give it. I sat with that for a moment. 20 years of a different version of things, sitting right there in a coffee shop on a Thursday in October in a sentence. I said, "I didn't know that." He said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you now." We stayed until the coffee shop started filling up with the afternoon crowd, and then we stayed a little longer, and eventually I looked at my watch and said I needed to go pick up Clara from school, and he said of course, and we both stood up and put our coats on in that slightly awkward way of two people who are not quite sure how to end something that felt significant. He walked me to the door. Outside on the pavement, he stopped and looked at me and said, "I'd like to call you sometime, if that's something you'd want." I looked at him. This man I had known at 24, standing in front of me at 44, 20 years of separate lives between us, and something that still felt, despite all of that, remarkably familiar. I said, "I think I'd like that." He took out his phone and I gave him my number, and he looked at it for a second and then looked at me and said, "I'll call tomorrow. Not in 3 days, not next week. Tomorrow." I laughed, and it was the first real laugh I had had all day, and I said, "Good." I walked to my car, and I sat in it for a few minutes before I started the engine, just sitting the way I had been sitting in the coffee shop 2 hours earlier, except that everything felt different now, lighter somehow, like something that had been held at a low tension for a very long time had very quietly been released. He called the next day. We had coffee again the following weekend, just coffee, nothing dramatic, two people sitting across from each other and learning who they had each become in the years since the train platform. And at the end of that second coffee, when we were putting our coats on again and doing that slightly awkward end of something thing again, he looked at me and said, "I think we got the timing wrong the first time." I put my scarf on and I looked at him and I said, "I think you might be right." And then we walked out into the November afternoon together, not holding hands, not making promises, just two people who had found each other again after 20 years and were, for the first time in a long time, genuinely curious about what came next.